The day I walked into my father's retirement party wearing my hospital badge, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would finally be different. I was wrong. My father has a way of making you feel like a guest in your own life. Not through cruelty, exactly. He never raised his hand. He never shouted. He simply had this quiet, practiced way of redirecting attention, away from you and toward whoever he deemed more worthy of the room. I grew up watching him do it, and I never quite figured out if he knew he was doing it at all. I'm the younger of two. My brother Thomas is 4 years older than me, and from the time we were children, my father treated our futures like they were two different kinds of investments. Thomas was the blue chip. I was the long shot nobody was sure would pay off. Thomas could bring home a B+ on a history test, and my father would call my uncle to share the news. I could win a full academic scholarship to pre-med at 22, and my father would nod slowly, the way you nod when someone tells you the weather, and say, "That's good. You'll want to be practical about the debt situation." That was his sentence. That was all he gave me. My mother was different. She was always different. She used to sit at the edge of my bed when I was studying late into the night, and set down a mug of chamomile tea without saying a word, just so I'd know she was there. When I got my acceptance letter from medical school, she cried for 20 minutes straight, and then apologized for crying, which made her cry again. She knew who I was before I knew myself. My father knew too, I think. He just chose not to say it. I became a cardiologist, not because I wanted to prove something to anyone. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I became a cardiologist because when I was 11 years old, my grandfather collapsed at the Thanksgiving table, and nobody in the room knew what to do. We all just stood there, frozen, watching someone we loved disappear in slow motion. The paramedics came in 8 minutes. 8 minutes is a very long time when someone's heart has stopped. He survived, but only barely, and for the rest of his life he moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, like he was borrowing extra time and knew it. I decided at 11 years old that I would never stand frozen in a room again. Medical school at Northwestern, residency at Johns Hopkins, fellowship in interventional cardiology at UCSF. By the time I was 34, I was back in Chicago, practicing at one of the top cardiac care centers in the country, and heading a research team studying advanced stenting procedures for high-risk patients. I don't say any of that to impress you. I say it because my father's retirement party was the first time he'd ever been in the same room with people who knew what those words meant. And I want you to understand what happened when they did. The party was held at a banquet hall in the western suburbs, the kind of place with chandeliers that are just slightly too small for the ceiling, and folded napkins shaped like swans. My father had been a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company for 31 years. He was well liked there. He had a talent for making people feel seen. The coworkers he chose to invest in anyway. His team adored him. His boss had written him a commendation letter that was framed and hung in the living room before the party was even over. I drove out on a Saturday afternoon in November, the kind of gray Chicago November that makes you feel like the sky has simply given up. My mother had called me twice that week reminding me to dress nicely. Not because she thought I didn't know how, but because dressing nicely was her language for please try, for my sake. So I wore a dark burgundy dress, heels, and I left my hospital badge in the car. Thomas was already there when I arrived, holding a glass of something amber and laughing too loudly near the bar. He had his arm around a man I didn't recognize, and he was doing the thing he always does, telling a story with his whole body, hands moving, voice rising, and everyone around him was leaning in. Thomas has always known how to fill a room. I used to envy it. By 32 I'd stopped. My mother found me at the door and hugged me for a long time. "He's in a good mood," she said quietly against my shoulder. "Good," I said. "Just go easy," she said. I didn't ask her what she meant. I already knew. My father was holding court near the gift table, surrounded by 4 or 5 men I vaguely recognized from company Christmas parties over the years. He saw me from across the room and raised his glass in my direction. A small, efficient gesture, the kind you give someone who has arrived on time but not early. I smiled and walked over. "There she is," he said, and then immediately turned back to the man beside him. "Ray, you were saying?" Ray was apparently in the middle of a story about a golf tournament in Scottsdale, and my father was absolutely riveted. I stood there for a moment, holding a glass of sparkling water, nodding at things I hadn't heard the beginning of. This was routine. I had learned years ago not to take it personally, or at least to perform not taking it personally, which is its own kind of exhausting work. Later in the evening, my father's boss stood up to give a speech. He was a tall man in his 60s named Gerald, silver-haired and deliberate. The kind of man whose presence in a room automatically lowers everyone else's volume. He spoke warmly about my father's 31 years of service. He mentioned the team he'd built, the numbers he'd hit, the culture he'd shaped. And then Gerald said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "I also want to acknowledge the families of the people who make careers like this possible. Because behind every person who gives 31 years to a company, there's a family that gave something too." He looked out across the room. "I had the chance to read a bit about your daughter recently, Walter." My father's name is Walter, though most people call him Walt. Gerald was looking directly at my father. "One of my physicians, my own cardiologist actually, mentioned your daughter's name to me last month. Turns out she was involved in a procedure that saved a colleague of his." I looked her up. I didn't realize we had someone like her in the room tonight. The room shifted. I felt it before I understood it. A subtle change in atmosphere, the way air pressure changes before a storm. Gerald turned to look at me. "Dr. Lawson, would you mind standing?" I stood. There was applause. Genuine, warm applause, from people who had spent the last 3 hours talking about quarterly targets and retirement golf plans. I looked at my father. He was smiling. The way you smile when the camera is pointed at you, and you aren't sure what expression your face is supposed to be making. After Gerald sat down, 3 people came to find me specifically. Gerald's wife, who told me her mother had recently been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation and asked if I had a card. A younger woman from my father's accounting team, who said her husband was on a waiting list for a cardiac evaluation, and asked how the process worked at my hospital. And then Gerald himself, who shook my hand and said quietly, "Your father never mentioned you were in cardiology." "He doesn't talk about work much," I said. Gerald nodded slowly. "Well, he should." I excused myself and found the restroom, mostly because I needed 60 seconds alone. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists. Something I've done since residency when I need to reset, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. I wasn't angry. That's the thing I want to explain, because I think people expect the anger, and it's more complicated than that. I had stopped being angry at my father somewhere around the end of my fellowship, when I realized that his limitations were not a verdict on mine. What I felt standing in that bathroom was something quieter and stranger. Something closer to grief. Because in 31 years of the same career, at a party full of people who loved him, my father had never once mentioned to any of them that his daughter was a physician. Not once. When I came back out, my brother found me near the dessert table. "Hey," he said. "That was a big deal. Gerald doesn't do that." "I know." Dad looked surprised. He was. Thomas was quiet for a moment, picking up a piece of chocolate cake and then putting it back down. "Do you think he's proud of you?" It was the most honest thing my brother had ever asked me, and I think it surprised both of us. "I think," I said carefully, "that he doesn't have a framework for what I do, so he doesn't know how to be proud of it." Thomas looked at me. "That's a very generous answer." "It's the true one," I said. Whether or not it's generous is a different question. I found my father near the end of the evening, standing by the coat rack, watching the room empty out the way he always does. Surveying what's left rather than celebrating what was. It's a habit. He's a man who is always scanning for what could go wrong. I put on my coat and stood beside him. "Good party," I said. "Gerald's a good speaker," he said. We were quiet for a moment. "He said something kind," I offered. My father nodded. "You've worked hard." 4 words, "I've worked hard." That's what he gave me. After 34 years, after Northwestern and Hopkins and UCSF, after the research papers, and the procedures and the patients I'd pulled back from the edge of something they didn't return from. "You've worked hard." I used to think I wanted more than that. I used to rehearse conversations in my head. Confrontations, clarifications, the kind of honest reckoning that only happens in movies and therapy sessions. I would imagine telling him exactly what it cost me to spend my entire childhood being the child he didn't know how to celebrate. I would imagine him finally understanding. I would imagine him saying something real. I don't rehearse those conversations anymore. "Thank you," I said instead, and I meant it not as resignation, not as defeat, but as something I genuinely arrived at. A kind of peace that doesn't require the other person to change. I hugged him at the door. He patted my back twice, the way you pat someone when you're not entirely sure what hugging is for. My mother walked me to my car. The November air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that makes your thoughts come out clearer. "He watched you all night," she said. After Gerald spoke, I looked at her. "He doesn't know how to say it," she said. "He never learned." "I know, Mom." She held my hands in both of hers for a moment, the way she's been doing since I was a little girl coming home from school. "I know it. I've always known it. Since you were this tall." She held a hand at about hip height and smiled, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite pride but was made of both. I kissed her cheek and got in the car. Driving back into the city, I passed the hospital where I did my first rotation as a third-year medical student. It's on the north side, tucked between a dry cleaner and a CVS, and the sign out front is the same pale blue it was 12 years ago. I used to drive past it in the early mornings after overnight shifts and feel this low hum of something I couldn't name. Purpose, maybe, or just the animal satisfaction of having done the thing you were built to do. I felt it again that night, driving past the blue sign in the dark. For years, I wanted my father to see me clearly. I wanted him to understand what I had built, what it had cost, what it meant. I wanted his recognition to be the last piece, the one that made the whole picture complete. But somewhere in the years between wanting that and now, I had quietly become a woman who didn't need it anymore. Not because I gave up, and not because I stopped caring, but because I had found, in operating rooms and hospital corridors, and the specific focused silence of a procedure that goes exactly right, something that didn't require his approval to be real. My work is real, my patients are real, the people whose hearts I've helped keep beating, they are real, and they are enough, and they were always enough. My father's retirement party was not the night I proved something. It was the night I realized I had already proven it, a long time ago, to the only audience that ever truly mattered. I got home just after 10. I changed out of my dress, made a cup of chamomile tea, same brand my mother always bought, same white mug, and sat at my kitchen table in the quiet. I thought about Gerald saying he should. I thought about my father's hand patting my back twice. I thought about my mother holding my hands at hip height, remembering who I was before I knew. And I thought, I am not the story my father tells about me. I never was. I am the one my mother kept carefully and without condition, in the part of her heart where the truest things live. That is not a small thing to know about yourself. It turns out, for me it was everything.